to our panel discussion on change and continuity in Japan-Russian relations, implications for the United States. This is a preview of a publication that will be coming out shortly that was sponsored by the Japan Foundation's Center for Global Partnership. And this publication features several different articles looking at various aspects of the Japanese-Russian relationship through different perspectives. We're fortunate enough to have three of the authors of those articles with us here today. On my far right is Andrew Kuchins from Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. In the middle is Shoichi Itoh, and to my immediate right is Testsuo Kotani. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce these speakers by offering a little bit of history on this subject, some personal history. When I first began my career professionally, it was in the Gorbachev period. And one of the first assignments I was given was to look into the possibility that Gorbachev's then dubbed new thinking in Soviet foreign policy might have implications for the prospects of a deal between the Soviet Union and Japan over the Northern Territories. This was a hotly debated topic more than 30 years ago. And here we sit several decades later. This topic is once again much discussed, and much like that debate 30-some years ago, there are some different points of view and some disagreements on this, and I hope in the course of our discussion today we can eliminate some of the pivot points in the debate as we think about the possibilities of some sort of fundamental change in the Japanese-Russian relationship. So why don't we start here with Testsuo Kotani and proceed down from there. Please.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation. So I will talk about the ongoing Japan-Russia negotiation on the peace treaty. First of all, I have to say I'm not a Russia expert by any definition. I'm just observing the Japanese foreign policy and security policy in general. But in recent years, every time I meet American or European visitors, they ask one question: why Prime Minister Abe is so keen on meeting with President Putin. Nobody expects this conversation with Putin will produce a certain substantial result. And this is actually a mystery, even for Japanese people. Japanese Russian expert, they also express concern about the prospect of the ongoing process. But still, Prime Minister Abe and President Putin last November agreed to accelerate the ongoing negotiation on the peace treaty based on the 1956 joint declaration between Japan and the Soviet Union. Under this joint declaration, the Soviet Union, the Moscow, agreed to hand over 2 of the 4 Northern Territories islands, not return. They say they agreed to hand over the 2 islands. And after the return of the 2 islands, we will conclude the peace treaty. That's the basic structure of the 1956 agreement. But over the past decades, Japanese basic position was to clarify the attribution of all of 4 islands. And then after that, we will proceed with the peace treaty. So in that sense, Prime Minister Abe has stepped down, backed off of the Japanese traditional position. And in Tokyo, I got a sense of a kind of optimism, particularly in Japanese Prime Minister's office. So I will try to provide my personal observation about why Prime Minister Abe and the Japanese government have been negotiating with Putin's Russia. So let me start with how Japanese government assess our relationship with Russia. The Japanese government in December 2013 for the first time adopted the national security strategy. And interestingly, this national security strategy doesn't regard Russia as a security threat. This strategy talks about North Korean threat. This strategy talks about the long-term concern about China's military build-up, but there's no reference to the Russian military build-up or military activities in the Far East. Instead, this strategic document regards Russia as a partner to improve the security environment surrounding Japan. And Japanese defense white papers, annual defense white paper, they still maintain a realistic assessment of Russian military capabilities. Russia maintains the SSBM in the Sea of Okhotsk. They still maintain a capable aircraft in the Far East. They even militarize the northern territories. They deploy surface-to-ship missiles in the northern territories, and they are modernizing the ports and the airport facilities in the disputed islands. But still, Japanese defense planners, they are concerned about Russia's capabilities, but I don't think they regard Russia as a threat, because threat consists of capabilities and intention. But Japanese defense planners don't think Russia has an intention to use those capabilities vis-a-vis Japan. So in that sense, Russia is not a threat to Japan. And I think this provides the context for the ongoing negotiation between Japan and Russia. An interesting episode is last December, December 2018, the Japanese government revised our 10-year strategic document. It is called the National Defense Program Guidelines. And former Japanese Defense Minister Onodera, he stated in an interview, one of the reasons why we revised this document was because we witnessed Russia's hybrid warfare to annex the Crimea 5 years ago. Russia used cyber attack. Russia used the electronic warfare, and the Russia's activities actually stimulated the revision of Japanese defense planning document. But looking at the newest National Defense Program Guidelines, again, there's no reference to Russia. There's a reference to China, there's a reference to North Korea, but there's a very little reference to Russia. And this document doesn't regard Russia as a threat. But instead, this document talks about Chinese cyber attack capabilities, Chinese anti-satellite capabilities, Chinese electronic warfare capabilities. So although Russia provided the context of the revision of this new document, but actually we're talking about the Chinese threat. So that's the basic trend in Japanese defense and strategic community. And interestingly, even after the annexation of Crimea 5 years ago, this perception didn't change. The Japanese government continued to regard Russia as a partner in the Far East and in the East Asia. And although we joined the G7 sanction vis-a-vis Russia after the Crimea annexation, but we continued and expanded the bilateral economic cooperation in areas such as the healthcare or urban modernization, urban environment, or energy conservation. All of them contribute to the Russian people's quality of life. And also we continued the territorial negotiation. And so I think, first of all, Russia is not regarded as a threat by the Japanese. And also, I don't think the Russians regard Japan as a threat. During the Cold War, the US-Japan alliance was a threat to Russia, to the Soviet Union. But today, Japanese defense posture is basically targeting against the Chinese. And we have shifted our heavy tanks from northern part of Hokkaido to the southern part of Japan. Maybe Russia regards the existence of US military in Japan as a threat, but overall Japan doesn't provide any threat to Russia. So the question is, so what's the objective of the peace treaty? Some people say Prime Minister Abe needs a foreign policy legacy, so he is trying to resolve his territorial dispute as his legacy. Some people say, we have a rising China, and we have to counterbalance the rising Chinese military power. That's why we need Russia. And looking at Prime Minister Abe's engagement with Mr. Putin, I think, first of all, yes, Prime Minister Abe is determined to resolve this territorial dispute. And perhaps he thinks this is going to be the last chance for both Japan and Russia to make any substantial progress on this. But definitely China is the important element. But I don't argue that the Prime Minister Abe is seeking a kind of anti-China alliance or coalition with Russia. I think at most, what Prime Minister Abe is expecting is, first of all, reduce the over dependence on China economically. If Japan and Russia concludes peace treaty and further expands economic cooperation, that will relax the over dependence on China by Japan and Russia, and which will make the options more flexible vis-a-vis China, and more flexible in the entire region. So I think what Prime Minister Abe is seeking is not the anti-China alliance, but it's more a kind of an entente with Russia to improve further improve the security situation, security environment surrounding Japan. So that's I think, the Prime Minister Abe's basic objective of the current engagement with Mr. Putin. But the problem is, as we proceed with the peace treaty negotiation, that might have a negative impact on the U.S.-Japan relationship, U.S.-Japan alliance. Russians already stated that the presence of the U.S. in Japan is an obstacle to the territorial negotiation in the peace treaty. And Putin said, looking at the deployment of missile defense system in Japan, U.S. missile defense system in Japan, looking at the relocation of U.S. Marine Corps facility in Okinawa, Putin thinks the United States is controlling the sovereignty of Japan. So even if Russia decides to hand over the 2 of 4 islands, definitely U.S. will try to deploy U.S. troops on the returned islands. That's Russia's argument. So if we proceed with this peace treaty negotiation, there should be a certain involvement of the United States. And some Japanese experts already say that the example of the German reunification can provide a certain hint. When Germany was reunified, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and East and Western Germany concluded the agreement that there will be no presence of NATO forces in the eastern half of Germany. So following that precedent, there might be a certain agreement between Japan, US, and perhaps even Russia about the status of the returned territory. So one possibility is we revise the status forces agreement between US and Japan, and we insert a certain provision that the US troops will not be deployed on the northern territories. Or more difficult way is to revise the US-Japan Security Treaty per se. But in any way, US involvement is inevitable. But problem is, given the ongoing US-Russian strategic competition, I don't think US administration is happy about the negotiation of such an agreement with Japan and Russia. And even the US Congress would be very tough, and the US military may not like that. So the basic, the irony is, although Japan's basic objective is to improve the security environment surrounding Japan, but that might hurt the US-Japan alliance, which is the core of the Japan's security. So I think, I hope this paper collections can provide a good opportunity for Japanese and American experts to discuss this issue of the peace treaty issue between Japan and Russia. So that's all I have.
Great. Thank you very much. I think you've given us some excellent food for thought as we continue the discussion this afternoon. Shoichi Itoh.
Yes. Thank you very much. for having me here. It's such a great honor to be invited by the event, by the Center for the National Interests in front of such distinguished guests. Well, it's already more than a decade since I was first invited by the Nixon Center back in 2000 to talk about Japan, U.S. Russia trilateral geopolitical landscape. At the time, I remember that we, both American and Japanese side, discussed how we could effectively engage Russia into changing, the Pacific Asia landscape. And as of today, I think I see very close to their prospect at first. Vladimir Putin is in power, I must say. My good friend has already noted that everyone is curious why Prime Minister Abe is taking such kind of conciliatory policy towards Russia. And well, my answer is just direct. So before going into details, I'm speaking everything in my private capacity, representing none of my affiliations. So I like to speak out my personal takeaways. And my shortcut answer is the title of the paper recently published elsewhere in Washington. I think Prime Minister Abe is being trumped by Vladimir Putin on this game. He has continuously insisted he still believes in Vladimir Putin is a man of his words. Do you agree? At least I disagree. But so it's quite debatable. At least almost no one is ready to do it in Tokyo, but future historians will definitely investigate and write whether he was pursuing his personal interest or national interest, or the interest for I don't know anyone else. At least I don't see any link with maintenance of the joint interest of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Let me elaborate my point. By the way, I'm very honored to do my presentation in front of my spiritual mentor when I studied Russian history, Winston Churchill. He left such big dictum that remind us how to understand Russia. Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Right? Scholars have debated how we should interpret. My take from his dictum is it's not so difficult to understand what they are thinking about. Very simple. Russia believes in only power politics. I don't think they do. They conduct diplomacy based upon trust between leaders, nations. Power is everything to understand how they behave. Well, my topic is energy. So let me elaborate the energy component, because whenever we talk about Russia, we cannot eliminate energy factor, because we go nowhere if we make a calculation of Russia minus energy, perhaps nothing else. Just to make the picture oversimplified for understand, because I read Russian literature, all sorts of things. I like many other things, but politically speaking and economically speaking, energy is close to everything about Russia, and it has been also likewise in terms of Japan-Russia bilateral relations. Let me give you some historical background. First, energy used to be much more important in the past in terms of Japan-Russia relations. But certain age is over. Okay, it has been of vital interest for Japan's energy security to diversify import sources of crude oil. Although we are still dependent upon the Middle East for close to 90% of good imports. And so soon after the first oil shock of the 1973, the time of Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka flew to Moscow to make a deal with Leonid Brezhnev to start to talk about Japan's possible commitment in the Siberian oil fields. And I won't go into details. And ever since the mid-70s, Japan began to make a commitment in Russian hydrocarbon resources. And as for natural gas, we are importing about 9-10% of LNG from Russia as of today, and I have figures in the side. And we are importing 4% of crude oil from Russia as of last year. Okay, please look at the slide 3. It shows that Russia actually made a striking debut to the Northeast Asian crude oil market. Perhaps some of you recall what is happening in the Northeast Asian energy market soon after the turn of the 21st century. Right? Actually, at the time, so-called Sino-Japanese scramble over Russian oil hit global mass media headlines again and again. At the time, Russia was just starting to export crude oil from the far eastern part of Russia, and now with that, with the construction of the East Siberian Pacific Ocean pipeline, Japan actually got near access to Middle Eastern oil. But what is happening now is that, number one, Russia doesn't have extra big capacity to increase crude oil exports to the east. Number two, most of the crude oil are signed up by Chinese long-term contract with Russia. Number three, this is information I got just a couple of weeks ago. The East Siberian crude oil potential is peaking in late 2020s. Wow. Okay. How can we interpret the 4% out of Japan's crude oil import portfolio? Russians sometimes say that the government is putting pressure upon the private sector not to buy more oil. Wait a minute. Japan doesn't have a command economy. The government has some wishes to enhance economic cooperation, energy cooperation with Russia, but they can't force private sector to buy more. And Japanese companies are buying all crude oil from Russia on the spot market, and Russia's spot oil is not necessarily cheap enough, internationally competitive, and plus, as I said, they don't have extra capacity to increase it. So we have very dim prospects. As for natural gas, okay, Japan is the biggest buyer from the Sakhalin-2 LNG project. That is two of the existing Russian LNG export facilities, and Japan is buying 9 to 10% of LNG from Russia, and now the President Putin is trying to persuade Japan to invest in the new Arctic project. Please look at the page slide 5. Sorry, 5. Okay. According to the International Energy Agency, the United States is projected to become the largest LNG exporter by the middle of 2020s, overtaking Qatar and Australia. Okay. But to change, we are going to help.
Go USA.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks. And actually, what Japanese companies, including utilities, gas companies, trading houses, already signed up agreement to buy total volume of 20 million tons of LNG, including purchase sales agreement, etc. But they don't. They're not going to bring back all the purchased gas back to the Japanese market because Japanese energy consumption, including natural gas, has already peaked, and Japan's volume of LNG import is actually declining gradually, amazingly in a sense. But recently, actually, Washington and Tokyo officially agreed to cultivate new LNG market to absorb would be additional supply from US lower 48 because it is Washington and Tokyo joint interest to increase liquidity of global LNG markets against the backdrop of such a serendipity of bonanza as U.S. shale gas revolution, and U.S. gas producers need to find new markets, some sort of guaranteed to safeguard the investment in the Lower 48, and Washington and Tokyo have agreed to develop new market to absorb that. But at the same time, what is contradictory is the fact that Tokyo has actually expressed strong interest to boost Vladimir Putin's new strategy to make Russia another LNG big power. And I don't think you need to know calculus, unless if you like integration, disintegration at senior high school. I'm not a math person, but I at least know elementary level arithmetic to say this. Japan and Washington trying hard to find a market for additional energy supplies from the United States. What's the point to try to help out, Moscow to make Russia another energy big power? I see big contradiction in this. Well, and secondly, I'd like to Japan's geopolitical fantasy. If you study Russia's diplomatic history, you know that China will remain such a big part of Russia's Asia policy. Whatever Japan does, Japan's importance cannot replace that of China. What is paradoxical is the fact that the more Japan makes commitments, the more the Russians are reluctant to accept Chinese presence. So in that sense, Japanese reckless commitment may simply boost even closer partnership between China and Russia. And lastly, I'd like you to look at the last slide of mine, because this is such a missing piece of Sino-Russian energy nexus that we talk about. Most experts exclusively talk about the gas and the oil relation between China and Russia. But what is happening in the global civilian nuclear market is quite interesting. Actually, Chinese and the Russians are intensifying the competition in the global civilian nuclear market. Meanwhile, China and Russia together are gradually increasing their part in the globally expanding nuclear market when both the United States and Japan are facing tremendous difficulty to sustain the commercial nuclear business for different reasons. For the United States, you have shale gas relation, gas is getting cheaper and cheaper. Japan is still suffering from Fukushima disaster syndrome, I would say. But both Japanese and American nuclear vendors are private sectors, but both Chinese and Russian nuclear vendors are state-owned. They could expand their presence regardless of commercial business interests. And I just keep asking many people here and there whether you wish to live in a world in which when global non-proliferation regime would be controlled by only Chinese and Russian. Right? If we read what is going on in global civilian nuclear market, that may happen. We don't have to exclude them. We have to find a way to shape globally growing nuclear market. But unless we find a way, including big political decision, how to reboost both American and Japanese nuclear sectors, we will have a completely different picture of non-proliferation regime against the background of different landscape of civilian nuclear market. Maybe I should stop here.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that was a fascinating presentation. I'm sure we'll have many questions for you on that. Andy Kachins.
Thank you very much, George. It's a great pleasure for me to be on the panel with distinguished friends and speaking in front of such a knowledgeable, distinguished audience. And I was very happy to be a part of this project. I should acknowledge Paul Saunders' leadership on the project. I read through all of the essays yesterday, and I must say it's really a good collection. So I really hope it comes out soon, because I think it'll make an important contribution to understanding here. So, and this is a very timely discussion because my next book, which is entitled Russia and Japan, An Unresolved Dilemma Between Distant Neighbors, is coming out later this year. No, actually that was my first book. I published it in 1993. Let me repeat the title. Russia and Japan, An Unresolved Dilemma Between Distant Neighbors. It's a good title then, and it's a good title now. I don't really see any imminent resolution of the island issue. I think that the possibility of signing a peace treaty is a different matter, which I'll get to. I must also kind of echo a bit George's introduction. Discussions about, well, we're returning to the 1956 declaration. Sounds a lot like, reminds us about the movie Groundhog Day. I mean, we've had this conversation over and over and over again. I am not optimistic about this one being resolved positively, and I'll tell you why. First, okay, these islands became part of the Soviet Union, part of World War II legacy. It's a Yalta legacy. So that's a very significant point, given the sacred perception of the victory in World War II in Russia. Two, the USSR, when it collapsed, lost an enormous amount of territory, and virtually all of the territory, close to all the territory that it had acquired in the context of the Yalta Accords. This may be the last piece that they have. Japan lost the war. They lost the war 78 years ago. They made a huge strategic error in carrying out the war. Losing these islands is a result of that. Let's not forget that. The best opportunity, I think, for a resolution of the issue was in the late Gorbachev period. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, I think the possibilities of a resolution dropped dramatically because of points I just made, but Gorbachev didn't stay in power long enough to make that happen. I remember in 1990, 1991, he was being accused of possibly being a traitor for being ready to sell out these islands for $2 billion. My thought was, if he can get $2 billion for those islands, he's one heck of a real estate agent. Okay, the third point I would argue is sort of against moving the islands. You know, I think the Japanese were heartened when in 2004, in the border agreement with China, the Russians actually did concede some territory in the Amur River. But this territory was not part of a World War II legacy. It predates that. And two, China was a rising power. Japan is not viewed as a rising power. I think there was some sense in Moscow that maybe better to lock in this border agreement sooner rather than later, because the power trajectories between our two countries are not going in a good direction for us. The fourth point, and Mr. Kotani referred to this, is the military value of the islands. You know, in the Cold War, these islands were always very significant about basically making the Sea of Okhotsk a Soviet lake and the bastion for the Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile capabilities. Well, and we know now that the Russians are militarizing these islands. These military contingencies, I think, are still significant. But for what? I think Mr. Kotani said pretty clearly that Japan does not see that the militarization of the islands as being for a Japan contingency. So presumably there's thinking that this is for another contingency, right? Well, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out what that contingency might be. The fifth point, and this relates to the fourth point, is that Russia is very, very, very covetous of the Arctic Circle and its plans for the northern, the northern, I want to say Silk Route, but it's not Silk Route, the Sea Route. Thank you. Yes, the Chinese are calling it the Polar Silk Road. That's what I'm confusing it with. The Russians, I don't think, are too thrilled about that new title. And you know, the Sea of Okhotsk is right there in the way of gaining access up to the east coast of Russia and into the Arctic. Back in 2012, when the PLA Navy made its first incursion into the Sea of Okhotsk, there was very significant concern in Moscow and in Tokyo about this. The Russians are very, very concerned about Chinese ambitions in the Arctic. And it's a very challenging thing for them to manage. And let's remember in 2013, when there was the question in the Arctic Council as to who would be new observer states of the Arctic Council, Russia was very supportive of Japan and South Korea. It was not supportive of China. That was just in 2013. Now, the Ukraine context changes a lot, but we'll get to that. The sixth point, and that's been referenced already, is that the possible transfer of the islands from the Russians raises the concern about U.S. military presence in the islands. The Russians have talked about this. The Russians, from their standpoint, have an extremely bad experience with this from what they thought was an agreement with NATO expansion going back to the German unification deal back in 1990. I think you're going to have a very, very hard time convincing Vladimir Putin that, and the U.S. Pentagon for that matter, that this could not be in the cards. I think it's That's going to be a tough one. So I would say, as for Mr. Abe, what happened in Ukraine in 2014 really hurt his chances, if he ever had a chance, for an agreement about the islands and a deal. Why? Well, if there had been no Ukraine, then China would have been much more the concern for both Russia and Japan and the United States, and they would have had more degrees of liberty or maneuver in negotiating. With Ukraine, obviously Japan, not very enthusiastically, but still imposes sanctions on Russia, and of course subsequently the Sino-Russian relationship has becomes much more close. So both Russia and Japan have far less degrees of freedom today, I think, than they did back in 2014, and I wouldn't have been too optimistic then. And just to elaborate on Shoichi's point about, I think comes out more in his paper, the importance of the Chinese relationship to Russia and for each other. You know, I remember Bobo Lo famously referred to the relationship about 10 years ago as an axis of convenience. I never liked that term, but definitely for the Russians, this is an axis of necessity. And if you look at what's happened financially for Russia, 3 times China has come to its rescue in a very significant way when Russia was in a difficult position. The first time was back in 2005. Remember the auction of Yugoslav gas, the crown jewel of Yukos, and the emergence of the Baikal Finance Group? Remember that? That's good. You know, initially the plan was actually for Gazprom to buy Yugoslav gas, but that plan was thwarted by the intervention of a district court judge in the state of Texas in a sort of instance of sort of stranger than fact. But the fact is that the Chinese came up with about $7 billion in order to facilitate that deal, since Deutsche Bank had to step out because of concerns of legal vulnerability. 2009, April 2009, this is again when Russia's still reeling from the global financial crisis. China comes up with $25 billion for Transneft and for Rosneft, a very, very, very significant lifeline of money, so to speak, at that time. And then I would go up to 2014, May of 2014. Russia again is looking in a very difficult financial position. It would be even worse about 6 months down the road when the oil price halved. But there was the May 2014 $400 billion gas deal for the Power of Siberia pipeline. There was also the Yamal LNG project. Now granted, in all 3 of these instances, the Chinese are buying low and negotiating hard, but nevertheless, these are very important for Russia. And I came across a stat that even surprised me reading in the Financial Times in December. There was an article about Rosneft deciding that they were going to be very cautious about entering business deals in Iran. But one of the data points in the article was the level of Rosneft indebtedness to Chinese sources. $73 billion. $73 billion. Now, I haven't had a chance to fact check that. Financial Times is a pretty credible source. But, you know, $73 billion is actually a lot of money. It's considerably more than the valuation of Rosneft itself. And, ladies and gentlemen, in the coming years, this relationship is going to add a new critical commodity to trade from Russia to China, and that is going to be fresh water. Very interestingly, in December, there was I think a memo of understanding, but basically kind of a deal signed for $80+ billion for the building of a canal from southern Siberia through Kazakhstan into China, delivering fresh water. Russia has the largest freshwater resources in the world. China is drying up. Okay, so this is going to be a very complementary relationship, and I think it's going to be a really important part of the relationship 10, 15, I'm not quite sure how many years down the road. Okay, my advice to Japan, forget about the islands. I mean, there's not going to be a deal on the islands. The strategic situation has changed dramatically, to say the least, from 1956 to 1991 to today. And I think just be a little bit more pragmatic. I would say sign the peace treaty. If it's for Japan, the rapprochement is important as sort of signaling to China. Russia would like to be able to signal something to China as well. I think go ahead and sign the peace treaty. Kind of let's separate these two issues and develop other parts of the relationship to the extent that they can. So if I go back to my old title, An Unresolved Dilemma Between Distant Neighbors, I would say you resolve the dilemma by no longer claiming the dilemma exists. And thereby, you don't have to be such distant neighbors. There will be a natural rapprochement. I wouldn't exaggerate it. I think really the key thing from the standpoint of Japan and from the standpoint of the United States is that Russia remains as neutral as possible in its perspective on the territorial dispute between Japan and China. I think that's the bottom line for Tokyo as I would see it. Now, just a couple of comments about U.S. policy, and I'll be finished. So, it's worth mentioning in the center formerly called Nixon, there's been quite a bit of talk about a 1972 in reverse, i.e. a U.S. pivot to Russia at the expense of China. Well, I would say before Ukraine, there might have been, perhaps, this could have been a limited option, perhaps, but I think I wouldn't have exaggerated it then. But today, I think it's really a totally unrealistic idea. You know, the U.S.-Russia relationship has reached such a poor point. We disagree on so many things, and particularly when, from the Russian perspective, now these sanctions have been codified, they've been legislated. From their standpoint, that's pretty much forever. They remember the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. There's no clear criteria for what would be reasons for withdrawing the sanctions. You know, the idea that somehow we can easily make a play on Russia is, to me, nonsense, frankly. And I think it's significant. There's a tendency to significantly underestimate the degree of trust and political capital that has been built between Beijing and Moscow, and particularly between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. It's, like I said, I don't think it's just an axis of convenience. Nevertheless, I think that the way that we framed our withdrawal from the INF agreement was, I think, on the money for Moscow. And I think they understand this, that we are leaving the INF, we left the INF agreement, mainly out of concern for what China and other countries are doing, not so much about Russia. And Russia is not a loser with the withdrawal from this agreement. It's Europe which is the loser from the withdrawal of this agreement because of their concerns that there could be another arms race in Europe. But I think when, I don't agree with a lot of things that John Bolton has said historically, but when he went to Moscow and he reminded the Russians that they live in a multipolar rocket environment, you know, the fact is they do, and the Russians know that. Finally, I would say we need to revive the TPP. You know, this was really a great achievement, I think, economically and strategically. To me, it was by far the most important aspect of the Asia pivot or rebalancing. Hey, let's call it what it is, the China containment strategy, okay? But withdrawing from it, it really left our Asian allies, and especially Japan, in the lurch. You know, they have not joined the AIIB. And let's, just as a sideline, the AIIB is the show pony for the funding of China's Belt and Road Initiative projects. The vast majority of the funding comes from the Chinese development banks and state-owned banks. The AIIB actually is a very well-run institution, but that's not really where the big money action is at. But at any rate, Japan has not joined it, still may not, but they are looking now for a way to partner with China on some of the Belt and Road Initiative projects. I think it's a classic case of whether you balance or whether you bandwagon. And if there's more question about U.S. commitment to the region, whether it's economically or strategically, in this case it's economically, then that's going to put more pressure on our allies, particularly Japan, to look for ways to bandwagon in some ways with China to hedge. And did we not realize that actually the TPP and the pivot was a major stimulus for the Chinese to consolidate the Belt and Road strategy 6 years ago? I mean, as Shoichi likes, he very much likes this phrase, I would say withdrawing from the TPP was an own goal for Washington. And I hope that we can correct that. Last point, George, to me, Russia-Japanese rapprochement is in Washington's interest. It's been in Washington's interest since the collapse of the USSR. I would say actually since the Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s, it would have been in the US interest. The Soviets and the Russians have always viewed the Japanese-American security alliance historically somewhat different from quite differently than how they view NATO. And in 2014, this is still the case. I think still today it is the case, but I think we need to keep our expectations very, very modest about how far it can go. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy, and thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator and pose the first question. We do have some questions in the audience I know are waiting. I want to ask on this question of U.S. interests, I sense a little bit of difference of opinion among the panelists as to whether a breakthrough in the Japanese-Russian relationship is in America's interest or not. And I also want to ask if it is, in fact, in U.S. interest to see some sort of improvement, significant improvement in between Tokyo and Moscow. Is there anything that the United States could do that might facilitate that in some way? One possibility that's been raised here is on the demilitarization of 2 of those islands. Is that something were the United States to announce that it has no interest in and no plans or intentions under current or foreseeable circumstances to resurrect some old language there, to militarize those islands? Would that matter to the prospects of a deal?
Well, actually, U.S., I just forgot his name. One of his commander already officially expressed that U.S. has no interest to deploy U.S. troops in the Northern Ireland. And a little security expert asked Mr. Kotani about this, but I myself see no reason for the U.S. to deploy troops over there. But the question is different. Why do we need to make such a promise with Russia, even if U.S. has no interest in it? Why do we have to accept Moscow's opinion? How to interpret U.S.-Japan alliance? I don't see any reason. And well, if it is not so complicated to find an approachment or improve relations between Japan and Russia, it might turn out a strategic card for Washington to play out in the Asia Pacific. But the question is, what would be the method? Well, if it is unconditional for Putin to sign peace treaty, to have Japan paying no sacrifice, that would be okay. But if Japan needs to pay some extra costs, especially that might incur upon U.S. interests, including business energy interests, what is the point? I don't see any reason. Without signing peace treaty, we already have a kind of established business relations between the two. With the signing of peace treaty, it wouldn't boost Japanese business sector's interest in Russia. Businessmen will go everywhere whenever they can make money. They don't go into Russian market too much just because they are convinced they can't make money easy. And the peace treaty wouldn't be a remedy for that. And well, actually, the Japanese-Russian cultural exchange is, rapidly, improving. So I don't see any impending reason to sign peace treaty in the immediate future. But with that, Putin could send a message domestically and internationally. He could have successfully given a wedge upon the unity of G7 nations.
Other comments?
Yeah. So I guess I go back on the whether an island deal would be in U.S. interest. That's sort of the question, George. Okay.
Assuming that an island deal is a prerequisite to some sort of broader rapprochement between the two countries.
Right. I don't know. I feel like responding like George H.W. Bush, too hypothetical, because I'm pessimistic about the likelihood of there being an island deal. I really don't see what's in it for the Russians to make a deal on the islands. The Japanese are not going to dramatically increase their investments in the Russian Far East and Siberia. That's not what's been blocking them, I think, as Shoichi said. I think that the Russians will insist on an agreement that would be more credible, let's say, than their understanding of what they did not. Well, frankly, their mistake in 1990 was they didn't demand on paper any agreement for non-expansion of NATO for the German reunification deal. And the George H.W. Bush administration certainly didn't want that to happen because they were concerned that the Germans would have been ready to, because unification was such an overreaching goal, they would have been ready to do it. And we would have had our hands tied, not that we were planning to expand NATO. But that's, that history, I think, is such a sticking point, not only in Putin's head, but for the Russian elite's head. I just can't imagine that, that being agreed easily. Maybe for the two islands, Shikotan and Habamai. Habamai is just a bunch of rocks. So kind of military, and I don't think there are. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there are military deployments on Shikotan. It's Itoh and Torofu, the larger islands that we're talking about. So maybe you could have a deal with no military deployments on the two islands, but certainly not on the four. And I think it's time for the Japanese to kind of reverse the order. The islands, losing the islands, is it really a big strategic loss? Does it really hurt their security to lose those islands? If in fact they already do not view Russian deployments on the islands as a threat, and if the Japanese don't view Russian deployments on those islands as a threat, then why should we? And again, I think you can get some mileage out of signing the treaty. I know it's a little bit of kabuki, so to speak, but you are sending a message that, look, we have come to an agreement on something we haven't been able to agree on for 73 years, and I know that's not going to open the magic key to investments into the region, but it might, Bashago, step by step, maybe kind of loosen things up a little bit. What do you have to lose?
Yeah, a couple of points. First of all, when I talk to the Japanese government officials who are engaged in this ongoing process, they tell me that the Abe Putin have met 25 times, and most of the times most of the meetings, they had a one-on-one meetings, and they say, don't you think they have agreed on a certain script? That's the response from the government officials who expressed their optimism about the ongoing process. And I actually don't know whether there's any script or established scenario, but that's the basic response from the Japanese government officials, the negotiators. So that is the source of the optimism, I think, in the Japanese government. And about the U.S. interest in Japan-Russia rapprochement, I don't think even if Japan can resolve the territorial dispute with Russia and conclude a peace treaty, that will provide a direct interest to the United States. But if the better relationship between Japan and Russia is the interest of Japan, and if U.S. assists Japan to achieve such a goal, I think that will be a big plus for the U.S.-Japan relationship. So in that sense, that might be an interest of the United States. And for Prime Minister Abe, his basic objective, overall objective, is to get Japan out of the post-World War II regime. And the territorial dispute with Russia is part of it. And of course, the normalization with North Korea is another element. And this is why he has been working on those issues. But if U.S. is willing to assist Abe to achieve his overall objective, that might strengthen the U.S.-Japan relationship, and that might be in the U.S. interest.
Okay, very good. Michael Vlahos.
Yeah, I had a question and a comment. My comment is, you all have voiced by implication that for some time now, Japan has not been a rising power, maybe since the 90s, and in some quarters of perception, even a non-dynamic power. But I disagree in the sense that Japan has a lever that it hasn't really pulled to maximum advantage, and that is to develop further in a more dramatic fashion its defense buildup. It's already, I think, from everything I see in the region in terms of commentary and other kinds of conceptual emissions, that the buildup, the Kaga and Izumo, the purchasing of Stovall F-35s, for example, to give these carriers a strike component. There's a lot that's going on that's given Japan more leverage. If it were to do more of that, I mean, not a huge amount, but a lot more than what we're seeing now, that I think would be of advantage to Japan, not simply against China, but also in its relations with Russia, by offering Russia alternatives to its growing dependence on China. And what I see happening now with Russia and China is almost exactly a flip of the Moscow-Beijing relations of the 50s, in which China was made subservient. And I think Russia remembers that. Certainly the Chinese do, and what was asked of them after the Korean War, which was pretty awful. And so there must be suspicions lurking in the back of the Russian mind that if they become dependent on China, that they will be vulnerable and at risk. And a more powerful Japan, therefore, is a useful alternative that Russia can call on, not in the near term, but I'm talking in the longer term. So I'm a great proponent of Japan building up its leverage vis-a-vis China, Russia, and the U.S. by building up its military. I know there are lots of obstacles, but that's one thing. My question is, and I don't know much about the technological niceties of oil exploration and drilling, but I have watched Russian promotional videos of gas development in Siberia. And Russia takes great pride in presenting these in as large and dramatic a sense as possible. Would it be useful for Japan to become much more involved in offering technology and services to build up Russia's Arctic gas infrastructure? And would that not offset the fact that Russia won't be able to count on an increase in Japanese imports of natural gas? But instead, Japan will be exporting technology that will be helping Russia in a big way. And that will offset the hole they're in with the Chinese. So that's my question.
Actually, this is exactly what Putin is asking Prime Minister Abe to do it. But the question is the timing. Is it the right timing to do it now? Now we are imposing economic sanctions against Russia, and we are in the middle of the escalation of US-Russia relations. Well, Russian gas will be there for decades to come. It is more important for Japan to guarantee new market for LNG additions coming out for the lower 48. So I don't see any point to offset the merit of U.S. LNG exports, especially when no one is concerned about, increasing liquidity of global LNG markets, and no one is concerned about, LNG shortage in the next decade too. That's why, even the U.S. producers in the lower 48 are sometimes still going back and forth whether they should make final investment decision now or not. I don't see any reason for Tokyo to help out Putin to delay additional, U.S. supplies coming around. So the question is when we need to do it. Japan might be able to do that, let's say, after 2030, I don't know, it depends. But the timing is very important, and I don't think it is now.
Could I get a comment on the military side?
Sure. Go ahead, brother. Then I'll respond.
No. I'd just like to hear from you what your thoughts are on the utility and potential leverage of a larger military buildup. But I'm interested in your energy comments too.
Well, I'm the energy expert has spoken. I will note, though, as one of my graduate students at Georgetown did a paper on the Yamal project this past fall, and it was interesting to see that most of the companies that had been contracted to do the work building the infrastructure were Japanese and South Korean. That kind of struck my, it shouldn't be surprising, I suppose, but you see it. As far as I completely, first of all, it's good to see you again, Mike. I haven't seen you since I was a graduate student at SAIS many, many moons ago. But I completely agree with the point that Russia would view a more powerful and independent Japan as a more useful partner. And it's something I know it's sort of heretical in Washington for people to think, even suggest, thinking about moving off of some of these post-World War II security alliances. But I think thinking strategically, we should be pretty confident that a militarizing Japan, to the extent that it would, it is not to threaten us, but it is primarily to deal with the China threat that they see, and it would certainly give it would be more attractive to the Russians. I mean, the Russians are pretty straightforward in how they view power relationships. So I agree with you. And actually, it's an interesting just a sort of historical point. About 10 years ago, the Japanese were talking. One of the things I think we've made a mistake with since the collapse of the Soviet Union was not trying to engage the Russian military-industrial complex more. You know, and this is obviously, if we don't, then they're naturally going to be our enemy, and they kind of had been our enemy inside Russian domestic politics. But once the modernization program began in 2008, I raised a question with well, he had just been defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, about what he thought about more engagement between Japanese military-industrial complex cooperation and Russian, European, and U.S. And he jumped first of all on Japan. And there are, I don't think that the Chinese are going to be in a position to provide. That's not an attractive technological, I think, relationship for the Russians, whereas Japan would be.
Okay, most interesting. Wayne, Mary, and then over here.
But good luck convincing Washington on that.
Thank you. Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. Somewhat similar to George, in the mid-1990s, I was commissioned by then Secretary of Defense William Perry to basically study seriously whether the United States could be of assistance in settling the territorial dispute, because of the perception that this would be good for American interests if Russian and Japanese post-war issues could be resolved and a peace treaty signed. And being commissioned by a senior cabinet member, I took this rather seriously. And so I learned quite a lot. And you will notice that nothing actually came of that project. But based on it, I make three comments in the current discussion. One, regardless of what undertakings the United States might make about stationing American military forces on the islands, there is no way in the world the United States Navy is going to stop patrolling in, over, and under the Sea of Okhotsk, something we do regularly. The U.S. Navy regards that as a freedom of navigation issue. The Russians know all about it. It's been going on for decades, and it's going to continue to go on in the same way that all big navies regard saltwater as their natural purview. So the islands cannot be separated from the sea that they border. Second, the one thing about the Japanese-Russian discussions on the islands that struck me most is the extent to which the negotiators on both sides are not just ignorant of, but really oblivious about the domestic political realities on the other side. The Russian negotiators firmly believe that this is not really a serious domestic political issue in Japan, that a Japanese government could make a deal on the islands without serious domestic difficulty, which is not true. And the Japanese negotiators seriously don't understand that this is not an issue that a Russian government can make concessions on without significant peril. And I was compared this with other territorial disputes that I've been involved in, like Cyprus and Karabakh and a few others. And this is one
You haven't solved those yet, Wayne.
Pardon? I haven't solved those. And it struck me that this is one where the two sides, in many respects, talk past each other in terms of appreciating just how important these are domestically. And particularly, the Russians are just in denial that in Japan, this is a very political reality. Can you separate one from the other? So the day when Japan and Russia could talk about the northern territories, the Kuril Islands, segregated from other international issues, that day has passed. Now it takes place in a broader regional multilateral issue context in which Japanese interests are almost dwarfed by those of Chinese claims for islands all throughout the Western Pacific, which makes the diplomacy between Moscow and Japan
after the conclusion of World War II.
So after October 2018, when Abe and Putin agreed on the negotiation based on the 1956 Joint Declaration, Japanese media conducted a survey, and surprisingly, 70% of Japanese people responded positively about the two-island solution.
70%.
70%. So
Wow.
this is another source of optimism for the Japanese government. U.S. presence, U.S. military presence on the islands even after the peace treaty is signed. And I think this is basically Russia's tactics to drive a wedge between Japan and the United States. So that's one thing. And of course, the Japanese side understands that way. And and the domestic issue, I already answered, so that's it.
Well, the public opinion is very tricky because the answer depends upon how you raise the question, right? If they asked the return of two islands better than nothing, of course they support that. But the question is more complicated. They don't really, consider how much Japan needs to pay for, Russia's, Russian project from which the Japanese business sector may not benefit. It depends on questions. But overall, it is also true that the Japanese public opinion overall, regarding the territorial issue is becoming softer and softer because those who remember wartime period is just passing away, and young people don't know what happened in the past.
Base, you would have tremendous opposition to anything less than full return of the island. So I think prospects for resolution are very low. The part where I disagree with your comment, where you mentioned it's in the U.S. interest for Japan and Russia to resolve this issue, and I guess I would say it depends.
Yeah.
And I think the United States, since the 1950s, actually has done a pretty good job of, as you say, in diplomacy, managing the issue, because what we don't want to see is a resolution that weakens the U.S.-Japan security alliance. So if there were a possibility of a resolution that would enhance our alliance, that would be in our interest. But I think the chances of that are even lower than your 0% that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention this, and I think the U.S. has done a good job because you mentioned that this is a Yalta legacy, but the State Department has never recognized this as a Yalta legacy. What we say is that these 4 islands are Japanese territory administered by first the Soviet Union and now Russia. So if you look at a map, it's actually quite different. And the reason that's very clever Japanese administration over the Senkakus, and therefore we've said we are obligated to help Japan defend the Senkakus from China should it come to that. But getting back to your point, during the era when Prime Minister Abe was working with his counterpart during the Obama administration, I spent many an hour in the foreign ministry lobbying them after Georgia, after Crimea, after Ukraine, and it was pretty obvious to me from the Japanese perspective, they were thinking, what's the minimum I need to do to get the U.S. off my back? Because we want to resolve this issue with the Russians, and we don't want to sacrifice, you may care about Crimea, but for us, the northern territories are what matters. So they successfully managed. They did the minimum they needed to do. They can say they met the G7 sanctions, but we were always mad at them for not doing enough. And then what happened, there was, to be honest, within the State Department, quite a big argument. The Europeanists wanting to push Japan to do more, and the Asian is saying we don't want to sacrifice our alliance, so there's a limit as to what we can do. And so I think at the end of the day, both sides managed the issue. Japan kind of did what it needed to do. They implemented the minimum amount of sanctions, but they didn't sacrifice their relationship with the Russians and the possibility, slim as it was, of resolving this issue. So I guess the main point I'm just making is that I think whether it's in the U.S. interest or not really depends on how it's resolved. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that was just my take on this issue.
No, I would agree with you very much about that, James. All points. I was after Crimea, I was trying to do writing and meeting with people in the Obama administration, trying to kind of argue. You got to remember that, for Russia, you have to be able to separate the Euro-Atlantic theater from the Asia-Pacific theater. They're really very fundamentally different, and they've been historically different.
Thank you for making that argument.
Well, it didn't really, I don't know, it didn't really resonate too far, but I tried. But I think the devil is in the details, and I am worried that an island agreement that would raise the issue of kind of bringing this, relating it to the Japanese-American Security Alliance and the future of possible troop or military.
It's the islands that are on the Pacific Ocean side, not on the Sea of Okhotsk. If the U.S. really wanted a military installation on that sea, we would build it in Hokkaido, where there's an infrastructure and labor. We wouldn't build it on some remote island with no people. So I've always seen that as a stalking horse for Putin.
Right.
And what he really wants is to split the U.S. and Japan. That's his real interest in this, and that's what we need to be careful about. But could you comment on that? Are they really worried about U.S. soldiers coming onto these islands?
I think you're right in the conclusion that his goal is to loosen the Japanese-American security alliance, and so I think it's important.
Of U.S. forces on Japanese soil operates as a constraint on Japan's freedom of maneuver. in the international system to pursue its own interests. This is not an argument for an end to the alliance. It's simply saying it's the presence of U.S. forces on Japanese soil is a problem that constrains Japanese freedom of maneuver. Is 2.5 times the size of Russia's. Putin is going to cling tenaciously to everything in the hopes that he can ride out the storm, which he sees at some point in the future potentially even robbing Russia of eastern Siberia, for God's sakes. I mean, these are the nightmares that I think persist in the Kremlin. The only good news for Putin is there are no Mongol armies gathering in Central Asia.
Well, and he's got the water. Seriously, this is going to become a big strategic issue, I think. But I have a comment on your question, but you asked for that.
Well, although the Japanese liberal media might carry such article, first of all, the Japanese defense planners, defense experts don't think that way. And I don't think that's the majority view among the Japanese people. And because we have an Okinawa problem, such an argument may attract your attention, but I don't think that's a majority view in Japan.
I'd like to echo Tetsu's point. I completely agree with him. You don't have to worry about such a thing, and the majority of Japanese population do understand the importance of a U.S. base on its own territory, especially now that the so-called rival Chinese looming over, and for all other reasons. So, in this context, actually, Japanese society is different from South Korean society. Over there, they really have latent anti-U.S. based movement, but we don't have such a huge problem on the Japanese side. We don't have to worry about it.
Just a comment on the Russians. It's kind of ironic. The Russians viewed the Japanese-American security alliance to the extent that they viewed it positively in the Cold War, because it was sort of a cork in the bottle of Japanese military modernization, and that it was useful because it limited Japanese independence. Now the Russians would view it differently. Yes, I think they would find a more independent, militarized Japan potentially more useful for themselves. But it's hard to imagine the Japanese thinking, well, let's trade off.
One other point, just maybe on the side of optimism, back in the 80s when like half the room was also looking at the Russian-Japanese relationship, there was one that wasn't a formal, by no means scientific interview or poll
done. And I remember there was this guy, man on the street somewhere, I think it was probably Irkutsk, and he was asked, what about the return of the islands? And he said, well, if the Japanese are prepared